In this video, we'll take a look at migrating a 3PCC phone to enterprise firmware via local TFTP server. Please be aware firmware migration licensing is needed to be purchased for each phone that you'll be migrating. So if you're migrating the 8800 series phones from MPP to enterprise firmware, you'll need the licensing listed right here, the L-CP-M2E-88XX-CNV equal symbol. If you're migrating the 7800 series, we'll use the licensing right below that, the L-CP-M2E-7800XX-CNV. The other option is if you have a subscription to Flex and you've ordered the proper licensing for the firmware migration, then that would be the L-CP-M2E-Flex-CNV equal symbol. The chart I'm showing here is referenced from a very good white paper. The link is shown right below here. This is a document that gets updated over time, so definitely something you'd want to review before starting your firmware migration projects, just to understand what the most current information is as far as licensing requirements and any other considerations that you may need to look at. The next thing we're going to take a look at, which support group would you contact if you would run into issues? So if you're using the Flex licensing and you're trying to get the entitlement for that licensing, then you'd want to contact the MCE, My Cisco Entitlements team, and you would basically open a case via this URL. And then, as you notice here, it says here, please make sure to provide as much detail as possible in a case, including your subscription ID, your contract number, what type of licensing you're trying to get, exact quantity required, your Cisco user ID, any error messages you might be getting. So definitely, if you're having issues with the Flex licensing, then you want to contact the MCE group by opening up a case via this link. The other team would be if you went ahead and you placed an order for the licensing, firmware migration classic licensing. There's on the top of the chart, and you're having issues generating the licensing, then you'd want to contact the Global Licensing Operations, also known as GLO. And you can basically open up a case via this URL right here. And then if you're having issues with the phones themselves, so for example, you're not able to access the phone, you're having issues with DHCP or setting up the TFTP server for the firmware migration, then you would want to contact the Small Business Support Center tech support team. And then this item here is a very critical question, and I'll read this verbatim. My customer purchased the wrong phone type and needs to migrate the phone to the call controller they have. Can we do this? The answer, no. Please contact point of sale to return the phones and order the proper phones for the customer. Cisco will not replace the phones or migrate the phones for customers that make a mistake when ordering phones. So what this is saying is before you place an order for your phones, double check the part number you're ordering to make sure if it's for CUCM that you're ordering the enterprise phones. If it's for WebEx calling and or third-party call control like a open source SIP server or another cloud-based SIP service, you want to make sure ordering the MPP phones. And this information again is sourced from the white paper I mentioned on the last slide. A very good white paper. Definitely take a look at this white paper before starting your firmware migration project. Okay, next item is not all of the hardware is compatible or eligible for firmware migrations. So this table right here illustrates which MPP phones are eligible to migrate to enterprise firmware. And what this means is you still need to purchase a firmware migration license, but on top of that you also need to make sure the actual hardware, the actual physical phone, is eligible for the firmware migration, because not all phones may be eligible. So if you notice, we have 7811, 3BCC, 7821, 7841, 7861, 7832, which is a speakerphone, 8811, 8841, 8851, 8861, 8832, speakerphone again, 8845, 8865. These are video-based phones. And this chart, as the other few pages, was sourced from the white paper. And again, please take a look at this white paper at the time you're viewing this video, because it does get updated over time, and you want to make sure you understand the current information as far as what hardware is eligible, if there's any firmware licensing considerations, etc., etc. Okay, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the setup we have here for the TFTP application. So we're using TFTP D64 application. You can download this as a runtime executable, so there's no installation, or you can download installable. Typically, I download just the zip file for the runtime executable, and then when you finish, you just simply close the application and you're done with it. There's no installation. But in any case, so we have the application itself. I went ahead and I downloaded the latest binaries for the 8832 phone. So as of the recording of this video, it's 11.3.6 MPP firmware, because we want to make sure before we start the firmware migration from MPP to enterprise that we're at a minimum of 11.3.5 or above. So I'm using the latest firmware, which is 11.3.6 as of this recording. And the reason is, starting with firmware 11.3.5 or above, it supports one-step firmware migration, meaning there's no intermediate firmware, what used to be called the transitional firmware. Before 11.3.5, you had to actually migrate the phone from MPP over to transitional firmware, from transitional firmware over to enterprise firmware. So there's more steps involved and more opportunities to potentially run into issues during the process. So now you definitely want to use what they're calling one-step firmware migration, which assumes that you have at least 3.5 or above. So in this case, the phone I'll be using does have a little bit older firmware, so I'm going to first bump it up to 11.3.6. So I went ahead and I downloaded the zip file from the Cisco site for 11.3.6 firmware. I'm using a speakerphone to demonstrate this firmware migration 8832. I went ahead and unzipped it on my hard drive, and this file, or this folder that has these binary files, is actually being pointed to via the current directory. So the TFTP server, the current directory, is actually this location where these binaries are at. So in my case, it's C:\/ /user / desktop. So basically your desktop / I created a folder called TFTP, and then a / within that. When I unzipped it, it automatically created the CM term, and then the actual 8832.14-1-1, and then as you can see, the rest of the number. So this is really, and then of course we want to make sure the phone has reachability to the TFTP server, and also there's no firewall running on a TFTP server that might block this TFTP protocol transaction. But that's basically all that you need to do. So the setup itself is pretty simple. Once we complete the firmware upgrade from the older MPP firmware to newer MPP firmware, then we'll actually need to migrate the phone over to the enterprise firmware, and I have another folder I've created for that. It'll be this folder right here. So there's two items we have in this folder. So I've downloaded 8832 enterprise firmware 14.1.1, unzipped it in this folder, but I also need to place the classic firmware migration license. I talked about it earlier, the licensing needs to be purchased for each phone when you're doing the firmware migration from MPP over to enterprise. So this is the actual license that was purchased. It's actually specifically attached to the MAC address. So each license is for one phone. So if you have multiple phones, you need to basically purchase multiple licenses. And then each one of those is registered to a specific MAC address, and this .lit key is generated through the Cisco licensing website. So that's really the contents of our folder. Is we have the license file, we have the enterprise files, and once we get to the stage, I will need to change the actual path here where it says current directory to point to this. But that's basically it as far as setup for the firmware migration process using the TFTP D64 application. Okay, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the actual current firmware on the phone itself. Okay, it's 11.3.4 MPP, so it's definitely below the minimum version that's needed for the firmware migration. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually go ahead and bump it up to 11.3.6 firmware. And as I talked before, we have the correct folder, which is on the left-hand side right there for the 11.3.6 MPP. That's going to be the IP address of our TFTP server, PC, if you will. We do need to copy that .loads file. We're going to paste this into the phone firmware upgrade section. So we're going to go into the web interface of the phone. We're going to log in as admin, login. Then we're going to click on advanced. And then we're going to go under the voice tab. And then the provisioning tab. Then we'll go towards the bottom and find the firmware upgrade, specifically the upgrade role. I'm going to modify this line. I was doing some testing earlier. So basically we have the TFTP : / IP address of our TFTP PC / and then the file of the firmware, which ends with the .loads. And that's basically all we need. We just want to make sure the PC doesn't have any firewall like Windows firewall or third-party firewall that may actually block the TFTP firmware transaction to occur. Also, if you're doing this across the WAN connection like site-to-site VPN, you probably want to do a test. So I just applied that if you noticed. And we should see some activity here fairly quick. But what I was mentioning is, if you're doing this across a VPN, like a site-to-site VPN, you definitely first want to do a test run with like 1 or 2 phones, depending on how many phones you're doing. And you want to make sure that if there's any type of bandwidth limitations, you want to make sure you don't do too many phones concurrently, so you can, in a timely fashion, sequentially, maybe do 2 phones, 3 phones, whatever the bandwidth is going to allow. If it is a remote site, it probably would be best to go ahead and just use one of the PCs at the remote site and install the TFTPD application there locally with all the binaries, kind of what I'm showing this video if you have to do firmware migrations, if there's any type of bandwidth limitation from like a remote site to either a main site or a data center site, if you will. Typically, this firmware bump up from older MPP firmware to newer MPP firmware will generally take about 4.5 minutes. You sometimes might see some faster time, sometimes a little bit slower. Basically, what it's doing, it first ingested the .loads file, and then the .loads file actually is kind of a manifest or a directory that tells the phone all the different binaries, signed binaries, SBIN if you notice BIN, or SBN, extension for the phone to ingest. So it's going to sequentially go and ingest the needed signed binaries, and then once that's completed, the phone will actually reboot itself. And typically during this process, you won't really see any activity on the phone itself per se. But this is where the TFTP D64 application is good. If you notice, it opens up a child window, horizontal progress bar showing exactly what's happening. Also, if you've done everything correctly and nothing is occurring, one of the techniques you may want to do is you may want to either power cycle the phone and see if that kickstarts the firmware upgrade process. If that still doesn't work, you want to do a factory reset on the phone. Sometimes you might come across a phone that for whatever reason is acting stubborn, so that will be a consideration, because this TFTP process should execute within seconds. You should start seeing activity. And if you're not, then definitely want to investigate, power cycle, do a factory reset on the phone, make sure the computer is not running any firewall. So now we're going to take a look at the phone itself. So it's ingested all the actual firmware, and right now it's getting ready to reboot itself. The reboot process generally takes about a minute and a half. And then once the phone completes the reboot and comes up in runtime, then we'll actually do a visual validation on the LCD of the phone to make sure it's been bumped up to 11.3.6 MPP firmware. One item to note is you physically want to have somebody on site that can work with you. So if you're physically not at the same location as the phone, it is very critical to have somebody that's actually next to the phone that can actually relay information to you. If there's any problems, the person can tell you what the status on the phone LCD is. They can power cycle the phone there locally. They can go ahead and factory reset the phone. So that is very critical. You definitely want to avoid trying doing any type of remote firmware migration / updates without having some type of contact on site that you can reach out to if you run into any problems. Okay, so the phone's back in runtime, and in a few moments here we're going to go into the settings menu and just take a look at the status of the phone to make sure that it's been updated. Okay, so we're going to go into settings here on the menu, and let me try that again, settings, okay, and then we're going to go into status, and then we're going to look at the product information. Okay, it's 11.3.6 MPP, perfect. So right now the phone is ready for us to migrate from the 11.3.6 MPP over to the enterprise firmware. So now what we need to do is we need to make an adjustment to the actual folder that we're pointing the TFTP D64 application. So we want to point it towards the enterprise firmware 14.1.1. So let's find it here for the 8832. Okay, there it is right there. So we're going to select that. And we also need to copy the name of the .loads file for the 14.1.1 enterprise firmware. Okay, so let's go ahead and copy that entire name here. So we also want the extension, the .loads extension. And then we're going to go ahead and log back into the phone. Okay, so it looks like we're ready there, and we're going to go to voice provisioning tab, and we're going to go down to the upgrade rule, and then we just need to update the very last syntax portion to indicate the 14.1.1 enterprise firmware. And basically one more item, actually licensing. So we do need to also copy the file name of the licensing. And if you notice, we have the transitional authorization rule. That's what I just entered on the second line right there. So right now we should be ready for the firmware migration from MPP 11.3.6 over to enterprise firmware 14.1.1 using classic licenses. And this again is going to take approximately 4.5 minutes plus or minus some time. But generally around 4.5 minutes. And during this process, most of the activity you'll be seeing is going to be on the application itself, the TFTP D64. And this is why using this application is very useful. You can see in real time what's happening. If you do run into any issues, these packets are in clear text, so not only can you see what's happening on the application itself, but also if you run Wireshark either on this PC here, if you do a port mirror, source port is where the phone is plugged in, destination port computer with Wireshark. Since everything is done in clear text, you can very easily see what the phone is trying to fetch, and also any type of messages that perhaps are coming back from the TFTP server. If it's not finding the file, or if it's pointing to the wrong subdirectory, etc., etc. So we'll give this a few more minutes. And if you have a fleet of these phones to migrate, my recommendation would be you first want to do a proof of concept with 1 or 2 phones in your environment to make sure from starting point A all the way to the end point, you know, being letter E or whatever, however many steps you're doing in your workflow, you want to make sure that works from start to finish. And then you want to progressively increase the batch sizes. So the first 1 or 2 tests you want to do with 1 or 2 phones individually. Once you've proven that that works flawlessly in your environment, then the next batch might be 5 phones you do. If you're successful with that, there's no hiccups, you can bump it up maybe to 10 phones. You don't want to overcommit with too many concurrent phones. In case you have issues, you want to have enough folks in front of the phones that can troubleshoot the phones, power cycle the phone, factory reset, etc., etc. So it is a balancing act. And I did mention earlier, you physically do want to make sure folks are at the site that you can communicate with if you're physically not at the site with the phones. If you're using a different platform than Windows, here I'm showing it on Windows 10, but if you're using a different platform, other platforms also have TFTP applications. You may need to do some searching online to see what might be popular if using Apple platform or if using a Linux platform. So this is the most common application for folks who are using Windows, but if you're not using Windows, if it's a different platform, definitely want to do some testing ahead of time, research to make sure everything works correctly based upon your platform. The other item also I should mention, if in your environment it's not permitted to use TFTP protocol, TFTP server application, etc., etc., the phones also support HTTP. So if you have Apache 2 or something equivalent, you could also leverage that. Okay, so right now on the phone itself, it's indicating firmware upgrade in progress, meaning the phone's going to reboot itself here. And typically the reboot is about a minute and a half. And then once it finishes the reboot, we'll take a look, and the phone boots up into runtime, we'll take a look at the actual firmware validating that it's been updated, or migrated to enterprise version 14.1/1. In this video, we're obviously focusing on using local TFTPs. The reason you might use a local TFTP might be security policies in your environment. There is a method of doing this firmware migration using upgrade.cisco.com, also known as Cloud Upgrader, where you don't have to set up a TFTP. You do still need licensing. So just be aware, I'm showing this video for situations that you may have that either there's bandwidth limitations, there's security limitations, in a sense that your firewall is not allowing the phones to go out to the Cloud Upgrader, etc., etc. And for those reasons, it may be easier to set up a local TFTP as I'm showing this video. So you ahead of time, you probably want to analyze and see what the situation is at the site that you're needing to do the firmware migration from MPP to enterprise to determine what pathway may be best. If there's no limitations as far as firewall blocking, bandwidth limitation, probably Cloud Upgrader will be simpler because there's nothing to really download from binaries, etc., etc. The one thing I would note is you do want to make sure that the phones do not have old MPP firmware. So you definitely want to make sure they're bumped up to 11.3.5, or in this case I'm doing 11.3.6. So in that case you probably still end up doing the local TFTP. And we'll go ahead and take a look at the phone and see, just to verify that it's been updated. So settings, and then we're going to go to system information, and then we're going to scroll. If you notice the name, there's no 3PCC or MPP in the name. Yep, and there we go, 14.1.1 enterprise firmware 8832. Excellent. Hopefully this video helps you with the firmware migration from MPP to enterprise using a local TFTP server. Thank you for watching the video.